My place card skipped the family table, leading to a service tent beside a generator and melting ice. My sister whispered, "Stay out of the main photos. Your serious, corporate face will ruin my aesthetic for the in-laws." I did not argue or cry. I simply folded the notarized papers her financial future depended on, slipped them into my purse, and walked out. By Monday morning, those unexecuted pages would bury her marriage and beautiful lies. My name is Helena Stanton. I am 35 years old, and what I am about to share is the story of the day my family finally learned I was never the weak link they thought I was. It was a Saturday in late September. The location was Halcyon Point House, a sprawling Gilded Age estate situated on the cliffs of Ashcroft, Rhode Island. The air smelled of salt, crushed oyster shells, and the overwhelming, heavy perfume of 10,000 imported white roses. My sister, Lila Stanton, was getting married. The entire event was a grotesque explosion of ostentatious wealth, designed specifically to impress her new husband's family, the Whitakers. I arrived wearing a tailored, charcoal gray silk slip dress. It was elegant but strictly minimalist. I did not wear sequins. I did not wear layers of expensive tulle. I dressed to be present, to be respectful, and to blend into the background of what was supposed to be a joyful family milestone. My outfit was the complete antithesis of the aggressive, flashy pageantry that choked the manicured lawns of the estate. As I approached the grand terrace where the reception was being held, a bridesmaid dressed in a suffocating amount of blush-pink chiffon stepped into my path. She did not offer a greeting. She simply shoved a seating card into my hand and pointed vaguely toward the side of the mansion. "You are not in the main ballroom," she said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "They put you out back. Just follow the gravel path past the kitchen entrances." I stared at the heavy cardstock in my hand. It did not say Table 5. It did not say Table 12. I turned and walked down the narrow service corridor, my heels crunching loudly against the loose stones. The sweeping ocean views and the gentle melodies of the string quartet quickly faded, replaced by the harsh mechanical roar of 2 industrial generators and the rattling hum of massive metal ventilation fans. The path ended at a secondary canvas tent, pitched haphazardly on a patch of dead grass. It was the staging area for the catering crew. 3 giant blue plastic bins overflowed with melting ice, leaking warm water onto the ground. In the center of the chaos sat a single, wobbly folding table draped in a cheap, translucent plastic cover. Half-eaten sandwiches and empty water bottles littered the surface. I stopped. I thought, for one brief and naive second, that this was a catastrophic administrative error. I turned around and walked briskly back to the main entrance of the grand ballroom. A massive gilded mirror stood in the foyer, displaying the master seating chart in elegant, sweeping calligraphy. I scanned the glass. There, at the head table, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the groom's wealthy parents, were the names of my parents, Grant and Melissa Stanton. I kept reading. I checked every single table in the room. My name was nowhere near the family. Finally, I looked down at the absolute bottom right corner of the mirror. Written in plain, unadorned black ink, under a harsh, distinct heading labeled Vendor Overflow, was my name. Helena Stanton. It was not a mistake. It was a calculated execution. "Helena," I turned around. Lila stood there, framed by the arched doorway of the ballroom. Her custom, hand-beaded gown caught the light, sparkling with a price tag that I knew for a fact my parents could not actually afford. She wore a perfectly painted, painfully fake sweet smile. It was the smile she reserved for cameras and wealthy strangers. "Lila," I replied, my voice perfectly flat. "Congratulations." She glided closer, her manicured fingers gripping my forearm a little too tightly. "Listen," she whispered, leaning in so the passing waiters would not hear. "I am going to need you to step out of the main family portraits later. The Whitakers prefer everything to look incredibly uniform and refined. They are very particular about their image." I looked at her, waiting for a punchline that was never going to come. "Do not take it the wrong way," Lila continued, letting out a small, condescending sigh. It is just that you do not really give off a wedding vibe. Honestly, you give off more of an audit vibe. Your face is always so serious, so corporate. Having you in the center of the frame is just going to ruin the aesthetic we are trying to build with the in-laws. So just stay out of the way. Okay. She spoke to me not as a sister, but as if I were a visual stain on an otherwise perfect photograph, a minor inconvenience that needed to be swept under a rug. My hand instinctively dropped to the side of my leather tote bag. Inside rested a thick, cream-colored leather envelope. It contained a comprehensive stack of notarized legal documents. For the past 2 months, my parents had relentlessly harassed me, begging me to bring these papers to the wedding. They had painted it as the ultimate, final wedding gift for my sister. They swore to me it was just a tiny, insignificant administrative formality required to stabilize the family assets and help Lila transition smoothly into her new life. Just bring the envelope, Selena. My father had pleaded on the phone 3 days ago. It is a small favor. Just sign it and hand it over. It will make your sister so happy. I looked at Lila's perfectly contoured face. I looked at the extravagant ballroom behind her. Then, I turned my back on her and walked away. I returned to my assigned seat in the dark, noisy vendor tent. I pulled out a cold metal folding chair and sat down. For exactly 5 minutes, I simply sat there in the shadows. I listened to the muffled bursts of joyous laughter, the thumping bass of the band, and the crystalline clinking of champagne flutes drifting over from the main house. A lighting technician wearing a black t-shirt walked into the tent, grabbed a soda from the melting ice bin, and looked at me in confusion. He did not ask who I was, because no one wearing charcoal silk belonged next to a generator. The cold reality washed over me, chilling me far more than the ocean breeze ever could. I had not been invited to this estate to celebrate. I had not been invited to witness my sister's happiness. I had been summoned here to be put firmly in my place. They had deliberately orchestrated this entire sequence of events to humiliate me. They believed that by stripping me of my dignity, by shoving me to the lowest possible rung of their fabricated, high society ladder, I would feel so small and desperate that I would hand over the signed documents just to buy my way back into their good graces. They wanted to show me that I was nothing without their approval. I looked down at my tote bag. The cream envelope was still sealed. I stood up. I did not open my purse. I did not reach for a pen. I did not touch the lukewarm plate of leftover catering food that a passing waiter had just shoved onto my table. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not utter a single word of complaint. I simply turned around and walked down the gravel service path toward the valet stand. I handed the attendant my ticket, tipped him $20, and got into my car. I drove away from Halcyon Point House without looking in the rearview mirror. I left behind a family, a wedding, and an elaborate, expensive illusion. Somewhere inside that grand ballroom, Grant, Melissa, and Lila Stanton were likely toasting to their own cleverness. They were completely convinced that they had just executed a flawless, perfect humiliation. They had no idea that by pushing me out into the cold, they had just locked themselves inside a burning house. The valet stand was a temporary wooden podium set up at the very edge of the sprawling estate driveway, far from the glowing warmth of the reception. I had just handed over my ticket when I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of heels striking the cobblestones behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. My mother, Melissa, practically threw herself in front of my car door, just as the attendant pulled my sedan around the circular drive. She was out of breath. Her face flushed underneath layers of expensive cosmetic foundation. There was absolutely no apology in her eyes. There was no trace of maternal guilt about the dark tent, the melting ice bins, or the complete erasure of her eldest daughter from the family table. She grabbed the edge of my open car door, her knuckles turning a stark white, and leaned in close so the teenage valet could not hear. "Do not make a scene on your sister's day," she hissed through her teeth. Her voice was venomous, entirely stripped of the sugary, sophisticated tone she used whenever the Whitakers were in earshot. It was a revealing moment. Even in the middle of a family crisis, She viewed my quiet departure not as an injury to me, but as a potential blemish on the perfectly curated social image she was desperately projecting. To her, my dignity was nothing more than acceptable collateral damage. Before I could formulate a response, a heavy hand landed on my mother's shoulder. My father, Grant, wedged himself between us. He forced a tight, artificial chuckle, glancing nervously at the valet who was pretending very hard to look at a distant row of decorative pine trees. "Come on now," my father said, smoothing the lapels of his rented luxury tuxedo. "It is just a seating oversight. You know how chaotic these event planners can be. Let us not blow a simple logistical error out of proportion." He patted my arm, a gesture so utterly devoid of actual affection it felt entirely mechanical. Then, his eyes dropped immediately to the heavy leather tote bag sitting on my passenger seat. The mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing the absolute desperation underneath his polished exterior. "Just go home and get some rest," he continued, his tone shifting instantly into the familiar, demanding cadence of a man trying to close a tense business deal. "But remember to sign that paperwork before Monday morning. We really need to close the family file and get this administrative nonsense out of the way before the newlyweds fly out for their honeymoon. We are counting on you." I pulled out of the wrought iron estate gates and drove for 3 miles before pulling over onto a desolate, unlit stretch of the coastal highway. I killed the engine. I know. The only sound was the rhythmic, heavy crashing of the Atlantic waves against the rocky shoreline below. I sat in the darkness, letting the cold reality of my father's words sink deeply into my bones. The family file. That was his sanitized, corporate term for the June Stanton Legacy Trust. When my maternal grandmother passed away 4 years ago, she left behind a substantial financial portfolio. The absolute crown jewel of that estate was Blackwood Cottage, a breathtaking mid-century modern lake house nestled in the mountains of New Hampshire. My grandmother was a sharp, fiercely perceptive woman who understood the fatal flaws of her own daughter. She knew my parents lived perpetually beyond their means, constantly chasing a lifestyle of hollow luxury they could not genuinely afford. To protect the estate from being liquidated for country club dues and designer wardrobes, my grandmother locked the cottage and the accompanying liquid funds inside an ironclad trust. She named me as a co-trustee, legally bound to manage the assets alongside an independent fiduciary firm. I held the keys to the financial fortress. For 4 excruciating years, my parents had waged a relentless campaign of psychological warfare against me. They demanded I relinquish my fiduciary control. They argued, endlessly and viciously, that the financial safety net rightfully belonged to my sister. Lila was the golden child. She was the one with the brighter social future, the one marrying into a legacy family, the one who supposedly needed the capital to maintain her elevated, sophisticated status. I, on the other hand, was framed as the self-sufficient, boring corporate worker who did not require a trust fund to survive. They wore me down. Year after year, holiday after holiday, the emotional pressure mounted until it was suffocating. Today, I had genuinely planned to surrender. I had driven down to Rhode Island with a foolish, naive hope in my heart. I intended to sign the consent forms, stepping down from the trust and handing them complete, unmitigated control. I wanted to end the exhausting Cold War that had defined my adulthood. I viewed it as a final, monumental wedding gift. I was ready to buy my peace, sever the financial ties, and walk away from their toxicity forever. Sitting in the freezing car, I reached over and pulled the cream-colored envelope from my bag. I switched on the overhead dome light. The harsh yellow beam illuminated the thick stack of legal documents resting on my lap. I had thoroughly reviewed the digital drafts sent by their lawyer 2 weeks prior. They were standard relinquishment forms, exactly 30 pages long. But as I flipped past the title page of the physical copy, my eyes caught a paragraph of dense legal text that had not been there before. The formatting was slightly off. The margins were pushed a quarter of an inch wider to accommodate extra paragraphs. I started reading carefully, my corporate training kicking in. There was an entirely new addendum buried on page 14. It was a comprehensive release of liability clause. It explicitly forbade me from ever pursuing legal action or raising inquiries regarding the mishandling of trust funds prior to my resignation. I flipped another page, my stomach tying itself into a tight knot. There was a waiver of audit rights, meaning I was legally consenting to zero independent oversight of the estate's financial history. Then, I found a deeply unusual, heavily obscured clause tucked into the back. It was a confirmation of joint financial responsibility, effectively tethering my personal credit to a series of undisclosed financial obligations incurred by the trust over the last 18 months. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I flipped frantically to the very back of the binder, hunting for the signature pages and the technical riders. At the bottom of a highly complex rider regarding asset reallocation, my breath caught entirely in my throat. There, resting perfectly on the solid black line, was my signature. It was not a fresh ink signature. It was a high-resolution scan, slightly pixelated at the curved edges, pasted onto a document I had never seen, let alone authorized. Someone had digitally superimposed my name onto a legally binding financial trap. They had prepared a mechanism to legitimize my consent whether I gave it willingly or not. They just needed me to sign the front pages to authenticate the entire fraudulent packet, burying the forged pages in the middle of the stack. I carefully closed the leather portfolio, smoothing my hand over the cover, and placed it back onto the passenger seat. I did not scream. I did not punch the steering wheel or burst into angry, betrayed tears. Instead, a profound, freezing clarity washed over me, chilling me all the way down to my spine. Suddenly, the humiliating seating arrangement at the wedding made perfect, terrifying sense. Being banished to the vendor tent was not a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated psychological stress test. My family wanted to see exactly how much degradation I could absorb. They needed to know if they could break my spirit, push me into a corner of utter worthlessness, and still extract the blind, desperate signature they needed to finalize their scheme. They thought I would feel so small, so eager to buy my way back into their good graces, that I would sign the papers without reading the fine print. They thought they had constructed the perfect trap. They had no idea I was about to dismantle it. The drive north on Interstate 95 toward Boston felt less like a commute and more like moving through a frozen vacuum. I did not turn on the radio. I kept the heater off, letting the cold night air seep through the vents to keep my mind razor sharp. The adrenaline that had spiked in the valet parking lot had solidified into a heavy, freezing block of focus in my chest. I unlocked the door to my apartment on the 12th floor just past midnight. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. I walked straight to my home office, dropped the leather tote bag onto my glass desk, and booted up my dual monitors. The glow of the screens cast a pale, blue light across the room. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. It was already choked with notifications, missed calls piling up like a digital barricade, but I ignored them all. I opened my contacts and dialed the only person who could help me dissect this nightmare. Raina Cole answered on the third ring. Her voice was raspy with sleep, but the moment I spoke, she was entirely awake. Raina and I had survived the brutal trenches of business school together. Now, she was a senior forensic investigator at Ledger House Advisory, a boutique corporate intelligence firm that specialized in unraveling complex financial fraud. She possessed a mind like a steel trap and a profound disdain for people who weaponized family loyalty for financial gain. "I need you to open a secure channel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper in the empty room. "I have a physical document with a forged electronic signature, and I need to cross-reference it against county public records and recent asset transactions before Monday morning." I heard the rustle of bedsheets, followed by the heavy thud of a laptop hitting a wooden nightstand. "Send me the scans immediately," Raina replied, her tone shifting into pure clinical professionalism. "What exactly are we hunting for?" "My parents," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "They are trying to leverage the estate. Over the next 3 hours, My apartment transformed into a war room. I fed the physical pages through my desktop scanner, encrypting the files and sending them to Reina's secure server. While I analyzed the deeply buried indemnification clauses, Reina began tearing through the digital county registry, pulling property titles, tax records, and recorded liens tied to our family name. The silence on the line stretched out, broken only by the frantic, rapid-fire clattering of her mechanical keyboard. Then, she stopped typing. "Selena," Reina said, her voice dropping an octave, "you need to brace yourself. You are not just dealing with a forged waiver. You are dealing with a massive, active liability." A new document appeared on my shared screen. It was a recorded deed of trust. My parents had legally encumbered Blackwood Cottage. They had used the property, along with the projected future cash flow from the estate, as the primary anchor for a staggering commercial bridge loan. The lender was a high-risk, secondary market entity called Harbor Crest Capital. I stared at the principal amount listed on the screen. It was not a small, manageable sum meant for property taxes or roof repairs, which were the only excuses my parents ever gave for needing access to the trust. It was an exorbitant, catastrophic figure carrying a predatory interest rate of 18%. They took out a short-term, high-yield loan, Reina explained, highlighting the disbursement dates. "This is desperation financing. Selena, this is the kind of money you borrow when you have zero liquidity and you need cash to clear the bank in 48 hours. Where did it all go?" We began following the money trail, tracing the disbursements from the holding account. The reality of my sister's perfectly curated life began to unravel in stark, humiliating detail. The funds from Harbor Crest Capital had not been used to preserve our grandmother's legacy. They had been aggressively bled dry to finance Lila's extravagant 2-year illusion of wealth. We found ledgers matching the exact amounts used to clear heavily delinquent credit card balances. We found wire transfers covering luxury vacations to the Amalfi Coast, designer wardrobes, and exclusive country club initiation fees. But the most sickening revelation was the financial architecture of the wedding itself. "Look at these vendor payouts," I told Reina, pulling up a secondary spreadsheet I had managed to extract from a careless email attachment my father had sent weeks ago. The deposit for the imported floral arrangements, the custom atmospheric lighting, the dedicated digital content creation team, even the final payment for the beaded gown. "They are not coming from a standard joint checking account," Reina noted, pulling up a corporate registry database. "They are being routed through a third-party entity." She hit a key, and a new registration document flooded my screen. It was a limited liability company, incorporated in Delaware exactly 8 months ago. The name of the sole managing member was Melissa Stanton. My mother had set up a shell corporation. She was taking the borrowed, high-interest money secured by my grandmother's home and washing it through a corporate facade. By paying the wedding vendors through this shell entity, she created a sophisticated paper trail. If the Whitakers, or their accountants, ever casually looked into the source of the wedding funding, they would not see a desperate family drowning in debt. They would see payments originating from a private corporate account, projecting the exact image of established, independent wealth they were so desperate to maintain. "It gets worse," Reina said softly. "I just pulled the executive summary from the Harbor Crest loan application. Look at page 4. I scrolled down to the section detailing the exit strategy for the loan. My blood ran completely cold. In a formal, legally binding declaration, my parents had stated that Blackwood Cottage was weeks away from being entirely unencumbered. They claimed that the current trustee was in the final stages of relinquishing control, and the property title would be transferred freely and fully. They had not just lied to the bank. The timeline and the phrasing made it agonizingly clear that this was the exact same narrative they had sold to the groom's family. They had promised the Whitakers that the historic lake house would serve as a robust financial security net for the newlyweds. They had likely offered it as a piece of collateral for future joint investments, proving that Lila was bringing substantial legacy assets to the marriage. They did not just want my silence. They did not just want me out of the family portraits. They desperately needed my authorized signature to legitimize the entire fraudulent foundation of this marriage. Without my legal consent to release the trust, the bridge loan would default. Harbor Crest Capital would seize the property, the shell company would collapse, and the Whitakers would immediately discover that they had married into a family of destitute, manipulative liars. I sat back in my ergonomic desk chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting off the glass surface of the desk. The sheer scale of the betrayal was paralyzing. They had pushed me out of the main ballroom to break my spirit, hoping I would be so desperate for their basic affection that I would blindly sign away my protection. They treated my humiliation as a necessary administrative step to secure their survival. "What is the play here?" Helena asked. "Do I contact the compliance division at Harbor Crest? We can blow this entire thing up right now. I can draft a fraud alert and have it on their desks by 8 o'clock Monday morning." I looked down at my phone. The screen lit up again. Another incoming call from Lila. A text message from my father demanding to know where I was. A voicemail from my mother, likely filled with venom and threats about ruining the family image. If I flipped the table right now, if I called them and confronted them with the forged documents and the shell company, I knew exactly what would happen. The panic would set in. They would immediately start crying. My mother would fake a health crisis. My father would blame administrative errors and rogue lawyers. Lila would scream that I was trying to destroy her happiness out of pure jealousy. They would flood the zone with emotional manipulation, twist the narrative, and somehow position themselves as the victims of my cruelty. They would squirm, they would lie, and they might just escape by drowning the truth in pity. "No," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. "We do not alert the bank, not yet." "You cannot let them get away with this," Raina warned. "If you do nothing, that forged signature eventually gets processed." "I am not going to do nothing," I replied. "But if I strike now, they will just run. I need them to walk freely into a room where they cannot escape the consequences of their own choices. I need them to believe they have won." I reached across the desk, picked up my phone, turned on Do Not Disturb, and silenced the dozens of frantic calls and manipulative text messages pouring in from Rhode Island. Then I placed the phone face down on the glass. For 35 years, I had always chosen to absorb the damage. I had always chosen to be the quiet, dependable shock absorber for their reckless behavior, simply to keep the peace. But looking at the forged signature on my monitor, I felt that deeply ingrained habit die completely. I was not going to protect them anymore. I was going to dig deeper into every single ledger, every hidden account, and every broken promise. I was going to build a flawless, indestructible case. The investigation had just started, and I was going to follow it all the way to the bottom of the abyss. Owen Whitaker built his life on a foundation of structural integrity. As the chief executive officer of Whitaker Custom Homes, he spent his days analyzing blueprints, inspecting load-bearing walls, and identifying exactly where a massive structure was most likely to fail. He knew instinctively that when a foundation was cracked, the people selling the house would always try to distract you with expensive paint and imported fixtures. Throughout their entire engagement, his bride had painted a very specific, ugly portrait of her older sister. He had been told, repeatedly and with theatrical tears, that the sister was a deeply bitter woman, a jealous, resentful shadow who could not stand to see anyone else succeed or find happiness. He had accepted that narrative because he loved his fiancée, and because families were complicated. But as the wedding reception stretched deep into the early hours of Sunday morning, the expensive paint began to peel. Owen stood near the edge of the sprawling dance floor, nursing a glass of bourbon. He watched his new in-laws. They were not acting like parents who had just successfully married off their youngest daughter. They were not mingling with the guests or enjoying the expensive, imported champagne. Instead, they were huddled together in the dimly lit alcove near the coat check, their faces pale and drawn tight with panic. He slowly walked closer, using the loud rhythm of the live jazz band as cover. He could see his father-in-law gripping a mobile phone so hard his knuckles were entirely white. I do not care what you have to say to her, the older man hissed into the receiver, his voice tight with desperation. Tell her whatever she wants to hear. We have a hard Monday morning deadline. If we do not get that release, the entire thing collapses. Just get her to come back and sign the papers. Owen stopped walking. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. A release. A Monday morning deadline. Those were not words associated with a wedding celebration. Those were words associated with a pending legal disaster. Seeking a moment of quiet away from the suffocating luxury of the ballroom, Owen slipped through a side door and entered the small, converted study that the wedding coordinators were using as a staging room. The room was empty, littered with discarded walkie-talkies and half-empty coffee cups. Resting squarely in the center of a mahogany desk was the master planner binder. Owen set his glass down. He opened the heavy leather binder and flipped past the floral arrangements and the catering invoices until he found the section labeled Seating Logistics. He found the master chart printed that very morning, but underneath it lay 3 previous drafts, dating back over 4 weeks. He traced his finger down the heavy cardstock. On every single draft, dating back a full month, the sister was explicitly assigned to a table labeled Vendor Overflow in the secondary catering tent. It had not been a last-minute logistical error. It had not been a careless mistake made by a stressed event coordinator. It was a calculated, premeditated act of cruelty. They had deliberately planned to isolate and humiliate her, stripping her of her dignity while demanding she sign some sort of legal release. The structural integrity of the narrative he had been sold was beginning to buckle. An hour later, the reception finally ended. Up in the sprawling, vaulted-ceiling bridal suite of the estate, the bride was carefully removing her heavy diamond earrings. Owen stood by the massive windows, looking out at the dark, churning ocean. He decided to test a load-bearing beam. "Why did your sister leave so early?" he asked. His voice was casual, completely level. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The bride spun around, her face twisting into a mask of pure defensive rage. "Because she is toxic," she snapped, tossing the earrings onto a velvet tray with unnecessary force. "I told you how she is." She showed up looking like she was attending a corporate funeral. She took one look at how beautiful everything was, realized she could never have this kind of life, and threw a silent temper tantrum. "She cannot stand seeing me happy. It is honestly pathetic." Owen remained perfectly still. In his line of work, he mediated contract disputes and handled defaulting subcontractors on a weekly basis. He knew the psychology of a liar. When you asked a direct, factual question and the other person immediately launched into a vicious character assassination instead of providing a logical answer, they were hiding a massive liability. She did not explain the seating chart. She deflected and attacked. The lie was sitting right there in the room with them, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, the cracks in the foundation widened into massive fissures. The 2 families gathered in the estate dining room for a farewell brunch. Owen sat quietly, pushing eggs around his porcelain plate. His older sister, Brooke Whitaker, sat down next to him. Brooke was a senior executive specializing in corporate risk assessment. Her entire career was built on detecting financial anomalies and identifying bad investments before they ruined a portfolio. Brooke leaned in close, keeping her voice low so the parents across the room could not hear. "Has anyone on that side of the table actually given you a straight answer about this legacy wealth they keep casually dropping into every conversation?" Brooke asked. Owen looked at his sister. "What do you mean?" "I spent 20 minutes talking to the father about their estate planning," Brooke murmured, taking a sip of black coffee. "He talks a huge game about generational assets and secure trusts. But when I asked a basic, polite question about their asset management firm, he completely froze. He deflected and changed the subject to the golf course. There are absolutely no consistent details. Owen, people with actual generational wealth do not act like they are desperately trying to sell you a timeshare. Something is entirely wrong with their books." Owen did not argue with her. He simply nodded. Standing up from the table, he walked out of the dining room, strode down the long, carpeted hallway, and stepped out onto the private stone balcony overlooking the cliffs. The cold morning air hit his face. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He had memorized the sister's phone number from the emergency contact manifest the night before. He dialed the number and brought the phone to his ear. He fully expected the call to go straight to voicemail. If she did answer, he braced himself for a hysterical, screaming rant. He expected the bitter, jealous woman he had been warned about for the past 2 years to finally unleash her fury. The line clicked open on the second ring. Hello. Her voice was not angry. It was not bitter, or hysterical, or shaking with leftover tears. It was completely terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of someone who had just looked at a balance sheet and found the missing funds. "It is Owen," he said, keeping his own voice steady. "I am sorry to call you so early. I wanted to ask you about the paperwork your father was trying to get you to sign last night." There was a brief pause on the line. She did not complain about being shoved into a catering tent. She did not mention the melting ice or the humiliating seating card. She did not try to defend her character against whatever lies her family had told him. She simply cut straight through the noise, delivering a single, surgical warning. "Do not sign any papers they give you this week." The line went dead. Owen slowly lowered the phone. The sheer, chilling composure of her response shattered the final illusion. A crazy, jealous sister would have spent 20 minutes screaming about how unfairly she had been treated. A rational, intelligent woman sitting on a massive, explosive secret simply told him to protect his own liabilities. He turned around and looked back through the glass doors at the dining room. He saw his new wife smiling perfectly for a photograph. He saw his new parents-in-law laughing too loudly, performing wealth for an audience they clearly could not afford. He was no longer a blind, supportive groom standing by his bride. He was a professional builder walking through a house that was actively sinking into the mud. He folded his arms across his chest and began to silently inspect the damage, waiting to see exactly when the entire structure would collapse. Sunday morning arrived with a bitter chill hanging over the city. My phone, which I had left silenced and face down on the glass desk the night before, vibrated aggressively against the surface exactly at 9 o'clock. I turned it over to find a long, disjointed text message from my mother illuminating the screen. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, overflowing with crying emojis and frantic, flowery sentences about how chaotic the previous day had been. She begged me to meet them for a private, post-wedding reconciliation brunch at the extravagant Bristol Hotel in downtown Boston. She promised we would clear the air, heal the wounds, and move forward as a united family. I agreed to meet them. I did not agree because I believed her lies. I agreed because I needed to look them directly in the eye one last time before I burned their entire house to the ground. I arrived at the hotel restaurant 11:15. The dining room was a blinding, suffocating display of crystal chandeliers, starched white table linen, and massive floral centerpieces. A string trio played softly in the far corner, completely ignored by the wealthy patrons sipping mimosas. I found my family seated in a large, curved leather booth situated right next to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the busy street. My parents looked exhausted, their eyes carrying heavy, dark circles, but they desperately maintained their polished country club smiles. My sister wore a pristine, ivory silk blouse, looking every bit the triumphant, exhausted newlywed. And sitting right there, dead in the middle of the table, resting between a silver coffee pot and a tiered plate of expensive French pastries, was the cream-colored leather portfolio. "Darling," my mother cooed the moment I approached the table. She reached across the white linen to pat my hand with exaggerated affection. I pulled my hand away smoothly, sliding into the booth and resting my hands on my lap. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the porcelain mask, before snapping rigidly back into place. My father did not waste time with maternal pleasantries. He was a man running out of hours, and his desperation was bleeding through his tailored suit. He reached out and tapped the thick leather binder with his index finger. "Look, let us just put yesterday completely behind us," my father said. He used the exact same clipped, dismissive tone he utilized when firing a subordinate at his firm. The event coordinators were a complete disaster, and the seating logistics got horribly mixed up in the rush. We are incredibly sorry you felt slighted, but we are family. Let us not turn a simple administrative misunderstanding into some drawn-out, exhausting drama. We just need you to sign these pages right now so we can transfer the assets exactly as your grandmother intended. Then we can close the book on this and all move on with our lives. He slid a heavy engraved brass pen across the table. It rolled smoothly over the linen and stopped precisely in front of my empty porcelain plate. Lila picked up her crystal glass of sparkling water, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She did not look remotely sorry. She looked deeply inconvenienced by my presence. Honestly, Selena, Lila sighed, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. You really need to learn how to read the room. You completely ruined the energy of what was supposed to be a flawless, luxurious weekend. Walking out during the reception like that was so incredibly juvenile. You always have to make every single family event about your own feelings. I looked at the three of them. The sheer, towering audacity of their behavior was staggering. They had isolated me, humiliated me, and tried to break my spirit just hours prior, and now they were sitting in a luxury hotel, drinking expensive coffee, and demanding I apologize to them for not suffering quietly enough. They wanted me to comfort them for the inconvenience of my own degradation. I did not reach for the brass pen. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms against the cold edge of the table. If the goal of this meeting is a simple, straightforward legal transfer, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any warmth or anger. Why does the technical rider on page 28 contain a scanned digital copy of my signature on an indemnification document I have never even seen? The temperature at the table plummeted instantly. The string trio continued to play a cheerful melody in the background, but the silence inside our leather booth was absolute and deafening. The synchronized panic was immediate and physical. My father physically recoiled, pulling his hand away from the binder as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. He exchanged a terrified, wide-eyed glance with my mother. They immediately deployed the very first defense mechanism of the profoundly guilty they blamed the invisible staff. That is clearly an administrative error, my father stammered, his polished, commanding veneer cracking wide open in real time. The paralegals at the firm must have pulled an old, archived signature file by mistake when they were formatting the final draft of the contract. You know how completely careless those junior associates can be when they are rushing against a deadline. You are being completely paranoid, Lila snapped, her voice rising sharply in pitch. Several patrons at adjacent tables turned their heads to look at our booth. This is exactly what you always do. You find one tiny, insignificant clerical mistake, and you blow it up into a massive conspiracy because you are so bitterly jealous of my life. You just want to sabotage my wedding week because you have nothing going on in your own... My mother, desperate to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating narrative, leaned across the table again. Her eyes were wide and pleading, but her choice of words proved to be her ultimate, fatal undoing. Selena, please listen to me, my mother whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured, theatrical tears. We would never do anything to intentionally hurt you. We are just trying to protect the family. Remember 5 years ago, when I had to use your spotless credit profile to secure that secondary line of credit without telling you? I did that to help the family get through a few rough patches when the markets turned. This is the exact same situation. We are just leaning on you to keep everything stable and afloat. You know we always fix it in the end. Just be a team player. She thought she was appealing to my deeply ingrained sense of duty. She thought reminding me of her past transgressions would somehow normalize the current massive fraud. Instead, she had just openly confessed. She confirmed, out loud in a crowded restaurant, that exploiting my identity and my financial security for their survival was not an act of temporary desperation. It was a well-established, habitual pattern of abuse. They did not view me as a daughter, or a sister, or a human being with boundaries. They viewed me as a renewable financial resource. I looked down at the brass pen resting near my plate. I slowly picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy metal between my fingers. My father let out a long, shaky breath, visibly relaxing his rigid shoulders. He thought he had won. He genuinely believed that the heavy, crushing machinery of family guilt had successfully ground me down one more time. I placed the pen back onto the table, setting it down with a sharp, decisive click. I pushed the leather binder back across the smooth linen surface until it bumped against my father's coffee cup. "I am not signing anything," I stated, the absolute finality of my words hanging heavily in the air between us. "I am not resigning as the trustee today, or tomorrow, or ever. Furthermore, I am enacting a complete, immediate freeze on the estate assets. Nothing moves, nothing gets closed, and no money gets transferred until I bring in an independent forensic auditor to conduct a full review of the ledgers. And I want a complete, certified title verification for the cottage." Lila slammed her hands flat against the table. The heavy silver cutlery rattled loudly against the china plates. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. The sweet, elegant, soft-spoken newlywed vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious, entitled child she had always been. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of high society etiquette. "You are stealing my future. You are literally trying to bankrupt my new life in the middle of my own wedding week. How can you be so incredibly selfish and evil?" It was the exact same tired motif they had played for 3 decades. Whenever I established a boundary, they framed it as an act of unprovoked violence against them. Whenever I refused to bleed for them so they could maintain their illusions, they called me the villain. I stood up from the leather booth. I smoothed the front of my tailored coat. I looked down at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, inadequate, and crazy. For the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for them. There was no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering desire for their approval. There was just a profound, liberating emptiness. "You do not need a signature," I said, my voice cutting through my sister's hysterical, loud sobbing like a scalpel. "You need an obedient witness. I am not doing that anymore." I turned my back on them and walked steadily out of the crystal-lit dining room. I did not look over my shoulder to see their reactions. I left them sitting there with their cold coffee, their forged documents, and the terrifying, inescapable realization that their most reliable, silent victim had just walked off the stage forever. The speed of the investigation accelerated rapidly after I walked out of that hotel dining room. I returned to my apartment and locked the door behind me. My laptop screen was already glowing with an encrypted message from Helena. She had bypassed the surface-level metadata of the forged addendum and dug directly into the electronic notary verification logs. What she found was a violation of trust so deeply personal it made my stomach physically turn. "They did not just forge your signature," Helena told me over the phone, her voice thick with absolute disgust. "They stole your identity to bypass the security protocols. The Internet Protocol address for the notary session traces directly back to your parents' home network, and the primary verification document used to authorize the remote session was a high-resolution scan of your old state driver's license." I closed my eyes, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. 4 years ago, my father had asked me to email him a copy of my license to help set up a shared family cellular data plan. I had uploaded it to a cloud folder and forgotten about it entirely. They had kept that file archived, waiting patiently for the exact moment they needed a compliant ghost to sign their fraudulent contracts. But the deepest betrayal was buried much further down in the bank ledgers. I spent the next 6 hours tracing the secondary accounts tied to the June Stanton Legacy Trust. I was hunting for the source of the initial wedding deposits. The cash burned before the catastrophic bridge loan was ever approved. I found a dormant reimbursement account. It was a restricted, tax-sheltered fund specifically designated for my grandmother's end-of-life care. It held the insurance payouts and hospice reimbursements meant to cover her final medical debts and the ongoing maintenance for the estate. The account had been systematically drained. Tens of thousands of dollars, Money legally earmarked for a dying woman's comfort and legacy had been siphoned off without a trace of hesitation. I matched the exact withdrawal dates to the deposit invoices for the wedding photographer, the custom lighting designers, and the imported champagne distributor. They had literally financed a party using the financial echoes of my grandmother's death. I then pulled up the official asset inventory for Blackwood Cottage. Several high-value items were missing from the recent tax appraisals. A silver tea service, a set of antique mahogany dining chairs, my grandmother's vintage sapphire brooch. I cross-referenced the missing items with local estate liquidators and found the carbon copy receipts. My mother had quietly sold them off 8 months ago to cover their escalating credit card minimums. Feeling a morbid sense of curiosity, I opened Lila's social media profile. Right at the top of her feed was a polished, professionally edited photograph posted just 3 weeks ago. In the picture, Lila was wearing a stunning sapphire brooch. The caption read, "Feeling so blessed to wear my grandmother's intact family heirloom for my rehearsal dinner." It was a cheap, fabricated replica. The entire family was subsisting purely on an engineered image, a hollow stage set built over a rotting, terminally ill foundation. While I was drowning in fraudulent ledgers, Owen Whitaker was conducting his own demolition. He had returned to his corporate office at Whitaker Custom Homes, entirely abandoning his own honeymoon preparations. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, staring at a small silver flash drive his sister, Brooke, had dropped onto his keyboard an hour earlier. "You need to look at the files on that drive immediately," Brooke had said, her face completely pale. "I pulled a major favor with a corporate analyst who runs background checks on our potential commercial vendors. Lila has been very busy behind your back." Owen opened the drive. Inside was a comprehensive 40-page pitch deck for a newly incorporated business venture. It was a luxury lifestyle and event planning brand, completely spearheaded by Lila. As Owen read through the executive summary, the true nature of his brand new marriage became violently clear. Lila was not just marrying him, she was aggressively acquiring his family's infrastructure. The deck explicitly listed the Whitaker family social network, their corporate client list, and their established commercial credit lines as the primary foundational assets for her new company. She was planning to launch the brand 30 days after the wedding, using his last name as her ultimate marketing currency to attract wealthy investors. But the pitch deck was not the most dangerous file on the drive. Brooke had also uncovered a drafted legal document circulating secretly between Lila's private attorney and my parents. It was a post-nuptial agreement. The strategy was brutally simple and incredibly toxic. The plan was to present the document to Owen a few weeks after the honeymoon, framing it casually as a standard, boring procedure to consolidate their new household expenses and merge their insurance policies. But buried deep within the dense legal jargon was a joint liability clause. If Owen signed it, he would unknowingly assume legal responsibility for a massive percentage of the hidden debt my parents had accumulated to fund the wedding. He would become the ultimate, unknowing guarantor for their financial crimes. For me. Sitting alone in my dark apartment, the moral weight of the situation became completely crushing. If I exposed everything, if I brought the federal authorities and the bank investigators down on my family, the scandal would be spectacular and highly public. But it would also drag my grandmother's pristine reputation straight into the mud. Her legacy would be forever associated with fraud, theft, and public humiliation. It was no longer a simple matter of teaching my spoiled sister a harsh lesson about boundaries. I had to decide whether I was willing to protect the absolute truth, or if I would allow the dead to be endlessly exploited just to keep the fragile family peace intact. My phone buzzed against the glass desk. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but I knew immediately who sent it. It contained an address for a quiet, dimly lit botanical garden on the outskirts of the city, and a single time 8 o'clock that evening. I met Owen on a wooden bench situated underneath a massive, weeping willow tree. The night air was freezing, biting through my coat, but neither of us cared. Owen handed me a thick manila folder containing the printed pitch deck and the draft of the post-nuptial agreement. I handed him a heavily bound dossier containing the forged electronic notary logs and the drained medical accounts. We sat in complete silence for 45 minutes, reading through the absolute destruction of our respective lives under the pale glow of a single park lamp. When Owen finally closed the dossier, he looked at me. There was absolutely no pity in his eyes. For the very first time since we met, we were standing on the exact same side of the battlefield. We were not connected by familial affection or legal ties. We were united by the profound, sickening realization that we had both been targeted, manipulated, and utilized as disposable financial tools. If we confront them right now, they will scramble, Owen said, his voice hard and utterly uncompromising. They will destroy the hard drives, deny everything, blame administrative errors, and try to settle this quietly behind closed doors. I do not want quiet. Neither do I replied, looking down at the heavy folders resting between us. If we show our hands prematurely, they will just deploy their tears and their manufactured excuses. They will play the victims. We cannot waste our energy on scattered, emotional outbursts. That is how they always win. Owen nodded slowly, the rigid lines of his jaw tightening. They scheduled the final legal closing for the bridge loan and the trust transfer for Monday morning. Correct? Yes, I confirmed, my voice steady. They believe they have finally broken me. They think I am going to show up at the cottage, apologize for making a scene, and hand over the keys to the kingdom. Then let them believe it, Owen said. We formed an ironclad pact right there in the freezing dark. We would not scream. We would not send angry text messages or demand apologies that would never be genuine. We would simply step aside and let the Stanton family walk confidently into the exact room they believed was meant to legalize their ultimate victory. And once they were all inside, comfortable and arrogant, we would let the cold, unforgiving truth lock the doors from the inside. I drafted the text message exactly at 8 o'clock on Sunday evening. The words were deliberately chosen, crafted to offer the exact illusion of defeat they so desperately craved. I opened the message thread with my mother and typed a single, decisive sentence. I will be at Blackwood Cottage tomorrow morning for the final family file closing, and I will sign the paperwork, provided everyone is ready to fully honor grandmother's final wishes. I hit send and placed the phone face down on my kitchen counter. I did not need to wait for a reply to know exactly how that message would be received. In their minds, the brutal machinery of family guilt had worked perfectly. They truly believed that the dark catering tent, the isolation, and the sheer emotional exhaustion of the weekend had finally broken my spirit. They thought I was crawling back to them, desperate to trade my financial security for a tiny scrap of their conditional approval. The validation of my theory arrived exactly 1 hour later. I opened a burner social media account on my laptop and checked Lila's public feed. She had already posted a brand new story. It was a close-up photograph of her hand, heavy with the new diamond wedding ring, holding a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. The caption overlay read, "So blessed. Kicking off legacy transfer week at the family estate tomorrow. The future is looking incredibly bright." They were not just relieved, they were arrogant. They had immediately transformed what was supposed to be a tense legal procedure into a private, victorious celebration while they were busy toasting to their own perceived brilliance. I was moving with cold, absolute precision. A smart retaliation does not involve shouting matches or broken dishes. True destruction is quiet. It is logistical. It is entirely legal. My first phone call was to Elias Bramwell. Elias was a senior managing partner at Bramwell Pike Legal, a firm renowned for tearing apart fraudulent contracts with surgical brutality. I gave him a brief summary of the forged addendum and the shell company. He agreed to meet me at the property. My second call was to Raina at Ledger House Advisory, who eagerly prepared the compiled financial evidence binders. My third call secured an independent, highly aggressive title examiner who specialized in uncovering hidden liens. The final, most devastating piece of the trap required absolute anonymity. I used a secure, untraceable connection to submit a priority fraud alert directly to the Internal Compliance Division at Harbor Crest Capital. I did not give them the entire story. I simply provided the primary loan application number, referenced the disputed property title, and suggested that their closing agent might want to personally attend the Monday morning meeting to verify the signatures before releasing the final tranche of funds. Meanwhile, Owen was orchestrating his own flank of the ambush. He called his father, the formidable patriarch of Whitaker Custom Homes. Using the exact corporate language his father respected, Owen suggested a minor detour for their Monday morning schedule. We should take a drive up to Blackwood Cottage before we fly out. Owen had told his father over the phone. Since we are going to be discussing merging the family investment portfolios next quarter, it makes sense for you to personally inspect the legacy asset my wife's family is bringing to the table. The elder Whitaker, a man who never blindly trusted an investment he could not physically evaluate, immediately agreed. My parents had absolutely no idea that their private, forged closing was about to become a heavily populated, fully audited legal nightmare. I left Boston long before the sun came up. I wanted to arrive at Blackwood Cottage alone, hours before the orchestrated chaos was set to begin. The drive north into the mountains of New Hampshire was silent and incredibly dark. When I finally pulled my car onto the gravel driveway, the mid-century modern house sat completely still against the edge of the glassy, freezing lake. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The air was stale, smelling faintly of dried pine needles, old wood smoke, and the lavender soap my grandmother always used. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I walked slowly through the rooms, letting the profound quiet wash over me. For the past 48 hours, my mind had been a violent storm of ledgers, betrayals, and defensive strategies. But standing in the living room where I had spent every summer of my childhood, the tension slowly began to drain from my shoulders. This house was the only place I had ever felt truly safe. It was the only place where I was not treated like a difficult burden or an administrative problem to be solved. Walking through these silent rooms provided a deep, necessary moment of healing. I needed to remember exactly why I was fighting this war. I was not just protecting my own credit score, I was protecting the sanctuary of a woman who had actually loved me. I walked into the back study. The room was dominated by a massive, antique mahogany roll-top desk. I sat down in the leather chair and gently pulled open the bottom right drawer. It was filled with old utility bills and faded gardening catalogs. But pushed all the way to the very back, hidden beneath a stack of blank envelopes, was a small, worn leather notebook. I pulled it out and opened the cover. The pages were filled with my grandmother's tight, elegant handwriting. It was not a diary. It was a private financial ledger. I turned the brittle pages, my heart seeing with every single line. She had documented everything. There was a meticulously dated entry noting a loan of $25,000 to Grant to cover a disastrous stock market margin call. 5 pages later, a record of $15,000 given to Melissa to prevent a foreclosure on their primary residence. Beside almost every single entry, written in red ink, was a single, heartbreaking word: unpaid. But the final entry, dated just 2 months before she passed away, was not a number. It was a paragraph. Grant and Melissa will never stop chasing a life they have not earned, my grandmother had written, the ink pressing deeply into the paper. They have already spent their own futures, and now they are grooming Lila to do the exact same thing. When I am gone, they will look for someone else to carry their debts. They will try to force Helena to be their shield. They will use her loyalty to ruin her. I have to lock the doors. I have to make her the trustee, because she is the only one strong enough to tell them no. I closed the notebook and held it tightly against my chest. Hot. Silent tears finally spilled over my eyelashes, sliding down my cold cheeks. For my entire adult life, I had genuinely believed that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. I thought my inability to blindly support my family was a character flaw. But sitting in that dusty study, holding the absolute proof of their generational parasitism, the heavy, suffocating weight of false guilt completely evaporated. My grandmother had seen the truth. She knew they would try to sacrifice me on the altar of Lila's social climbing. The trust was never meant to be a financial weapon used against me. It was designed to be my armor. The final blow I was about to deliver was not about causing them pain or making them feel ashamed. Narcissists do not feel shame. The final blow was about fundamentally terminating a toxic dynamic that had defined our family for 3 decades. It was about making sure that the damage they created would finally remain entirely in their own hands. I wiped my face, stood up from the desk, and slipped the leather notebook into my briefcase. At exactly 9 o'clock, the sound of luxury tires crunching against the gravel driveway echoed through the quiet house. I walked into the main downstairs bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was wearing a perfectly tailored, minimalist, cream-colored suit. My hair was pulled back sharply. My expression was entirely unreadable. I looked exactly like the corporate auditor they so deeply despised. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase. It contained the perfectly ordered files, the printed bank records, the forged notary logs, and the grandmother's ledger. I walked out into the grand foyer, ready to step into the exact room they thought they could use to humiliate me into submission. I walked into the grand dining room of Blackwood Cottage precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. The entire space had been painstakingly transformed into a sickeningly sweet stage play of familial harmony. A lavish, perfectly curated brunch spread covered the antique mahogany table. Crystal vases overflowed with fresh white hydrangeas, catching the pale morning light. Expensive beeswax candles burned softly on the stone mantel, filling the air with a cloying scent of vanilla and spun sugar. Standing near the fireplace was Lila. She wore a pristine, tailored white crepe suit, looking exactly like the young, unbothered, and triumphant heiress stepping boldly into her next chapter of life. Grant and Melissa hovered near the silver coffee service. They were radiating an artificial, overly accommodating warmth that immediately made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They genuinely believed the text message I had sent the night before. They thought my presence here was a white flag. They firmly believed that the crushing emotional abuse of the wedding weekend had worked, and I was finally ready to submit to their demands. "Darling," Melissa cooed, stepping forward to offer a patronizing, gentle smile. She reached out as if to touch my arm, but I smoothly stepped past her. "I am so incredibly glad you came. The whole family just needs to close all these silly misunderstandings and move forward together as one unit." Grant checked his heavy gold wristwatch, tapping the glass face with his index finger. "The closing agent from the bank should be here any minute. Let us get this administrative paperwork sorted out quickly so we can pop the champagne and celebrate the newlyweds properly." Right on cue, a silver sedan crunched against the gravel driveway outside. A man carrying a thick leather briefcase walked through the front door. He introduced himself as the senior closing agent for Harbor Crest Capital. He set the heavy loan binder squarely in the center of the dining table, unclicking the metal clasps with a sharp, echoing snap. He pulled out a blue ink pen, fully expecting a routine, 15-minute signature session before he moved on to his next appointment. The closing agent's polite, practiced smile vanished completely the moment the front door opened a second time. I had intentionally left the heavy oak door completely unlatched. I did not come alone. I turned toward the entryway and silently ushered in my own counsel. Elias Bramwell stepped into the dining room first. His dark wool suit was immaculate, and he carried a heavily annotated legal pad tucked under his arm. Raina followed closely behind him, clutching the audited financial dossiers tightly to her chest. Beside her stood the independent title examiner, a severe, sharp-eyed woman who possessed absolutely no patience for high society small talk. The manufactured, vanilla-scented warmth in the room instantly evaporated. My father took a sharp, physical step backward. His eyes darted frantically between my perfectly calm face and the 3 intimidating strangers now occupying his private sanctuary. "Selena," Grant stammered, his polished voice dropping a full octave into a harsh whisper. "What is the meaning of this? Who exactly are these people?" Before I could even offer an introduction, the heavy oak door swung open a third time. Owen stepped over the threshold. He was not wearing the relaxed, casual attire of a man about to leave for a tropical honeymoon. He wore a dark, formal business suit. His father, the formidable and deeply connected patriarch of Whitaker Custom Homes, walked into the room right behind him, followed closely by his sister Brooke. The dining room, originally staged as a quiet, intimate victory lap for the Stanton family, instantly transformed into a brightly lit, inescapable legal tribunal. There were highly credible witnesses stationed on all sides of the room. The exits were effectively sealed by the sheer presence of the exact people my family had been lying to for 2 solid years. Melissa gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her manicured knuckles turning bone white. Lila's smug, heiress expression dissolved rapidly into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked like a cornered animal. "Owen!" Lila choked out, taking a hesitant, shaky step toward her new husband. "What are you doing here right now? You were supposed to be packing the car for the airport." Owen did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the thick leather binder resting on the table. "My father wanted to see the legacy asset before we formally merged our investment portfolios next quarter," Owen said, his tone as hard and unforgiving as concrete. "It seemed like the perfect time to visit, since everyone is already gathered here to formalize the financial paperwork." The Harbor Crest agent, suddenly sensing the massive, catastrophic legal liability currently vibrating in the room, nervously cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "Should we begin the signing process? I have another commercial closing scheduled at noon." "Yes," my father interjected quickly, pure desperation bleeding heavily into his tone. He reached across the table, grabbed the edge of the binder, and pushed it aggressively toward me. "Let us just sign the front page right now and let these good people get back to their day." I stepped forward and placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany. I did not refuse to sign. A flat refusal would have given them an immediate opening to argue, to deploy their manufactured tears, and to loudly call me unreasonable. Instead, I weaponized the exact legal process they were desperately trying to rush. "I am fully prepared to sign," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the dead silent room. However, given the presence of independent counsel and external investors, my fiduciary duty requires me to open the entire binder and read each individual item into the official record before I authorize the release of the family trust. I reached out and flipped the heavy leather cover open. It was a classic, undeniable truth. When you have been utilized, manipulated, and kept in the dark for over 3 decades, you learn very quickly that blinding, sterile light is the absolute only thing a chronic liar truly fears. My father lunged forward, trying to slap his hand down over the open pages to physically prevent me from reading. "That is completely unnecessary," Grant barked, shedding his sophisticated country club persona entirely. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "We reviewed the digital drafts last week. This is just standard administrative boilerplate. Just sign the paper. Selena." Elias stepped smoothly between my father and the table, blocking his reach. "Do not touch the documents, Grant. My client has the absolute legal right to review exactly what she is signing." I turned to page 1. I read the asset description out loud, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I pointed out, line by line, exactly how the property had been deliberately mischaracterized as unencumbered, despite the active secondary liens Raina had uncovered the night before. I flipped past the standard clauses and stopped squarely on page 14. The room was so quiet, I could hear the expensive beeswax candles crackling on the mantel. "Here," I stated, tapping my index finger sharply against the heavy paper. "We have a newly inserted rider that was entirely absent from the digital drafts provided to my legal counsel prior to this weekend. This specific clause attempts to irrevocably waive my right to future legal recourse regarding the blatant mismanagement of trust capital." I turned to the final section of the binder. "And here, on page 28, we have a set of initials beside a joint financial responsibility waiver. I want everyone in this room to look closely at these marks. The initials do not match the pressure, the angle, or the curvature of my actual handwriting." Lila could not take the pressure anymore. The suffocating, clinical reality of the situation was violently breaking her perfectly curated facade. She deployed her ultimate, historically successful weapon. She began to sob. "You are doing it again!" Lila wailed, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch. She pressed her hands to her face, manufacturing large, heavy tears that ruined her immaculate makeup. "You are twisting everything to make us look bad. You are ruining my life because you are a bitter, deeply jealous person. Please, Owen, do not listen to a single word she says. She is just trying to destroy us because she has nothing of her own." She fully expected someone to comfort her. She expected the entire room to bend immediately to her loud, theatrical, emotional distress. Instead, the independent title examiner stepped forward. The severe woman adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, leaned over the table, and pulled a certified digital access log from her own briefcase. "Save your tears, young lady," the examiner said, her voice completely devoid of any human sympathy. "I ran a deep forensic audit on the electronic verification chain attached to this specific addendum early this morning. The authorization traces directly back to a scanned, expired identification card routed through an Internet Protocol address registered to Grant Stanton. The entire digital execution is fraudulent. This document is completely legally insufficient for closing." The Harbor Crest agent practically jumped away from the mahogany table, his face draining of all natural color. Operating a financial closing with known forged documents was a massive federal crime, and he suddenly realized he was standing dead center in the middle of a meticulously planned trap. He snapped his briefcase shut and backed toward the doorway. The room fractured. The carefully maintained illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Grant stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping his throat. Melissa sank slowly into one of the antique dining chairs, covering her face with trembling hands, finally realizing that her shell company could not protect her from the people standing in this room. I did not say another word. I did not gloat. I simply stood there and watched them drown. I watched the Stanton family taste the exact, agonizing sensation of losing absolute control over their carefully constructed environment, second by agonizing second. I forced them to sit in the suffocating, inescapable silence of their own ruin. I let them feel what it was like to be entirely isolated, surrounded by people who were rapidly moving on without them. It was the exact same, hollow feeling they had forced me to endure when they shoved me out of the grand ballroom and left me sitting alone in a dark catering tent, listening to the muffled sounds of a party I was not allowed to attend. The trap had snapped completely shut, but I had not even delivered the final, fatal blow yet. Raina did not give my parents a single second to recover from the title examiner's devastating blow. She stepped up to the edge of the mahogany table, sliding a thick, neatly tabbed financial dossier right next to the disputed loan binder. "Since we are establishing the legal reality of this estate," Raina said, her voice echoing with the clinical precision of a seasoned forensic accountant, "let us examine the actual money trail that funded this weekend." She opened the heavy folder. "We traced the initial wedding deposits, the imported flowers, the custom atmospheric lighting, the catering retainers. That money did not originate from a family savings account. It was systematically drained from a restricted, tax-sheltered medical reimbursement fund. Over $60,000, legally earmarked for palliative care and hospice debt, was redirected to finance a party." My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, pressing her hand tightly over her mouth. "And when that well ran dry," Raina continued, mercilessly flipping to the next tab, "we found carbon copy receipts from a local estate liquidator. Antique furniture and heirloom jewelry belonging to the trust were quietly sold off 4 months ago. The proceeds were then washed through a newly formed limited liability company registered solely under Melissa Stanton, creating a fraudulent paper trail to make it appear as though the wedding was funded by legitimate corporate dividends." The heavy, oppressive silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of my father swallowing hard. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the small, worn notebook I had found in the study earlier that morning. I placed it gently on the table. "This is grandmother's personal ledger," I explained, keeping my tone entirely conversational. It meticulously details every single undisclosed loan she gave you both to save you from your own reckless spending. But her written words are not the only thing she left behind to protect this estate. Elias Bramwell reached into his suit pocket and produced his phone. My firm retained a digital copy of the final meeting we held with the deceased, Elias stated, setting the device down and pressing the play icon. My grandmother's voice, raspy but incredibly firm, suddenly filled the dining room. It was like a ghost had just pulled up a chair to the brunch table. Grant and Melissa will drain everything. Her recorded voice echoed off the stone walls. They will use blood and guilt to chain my eldest daughter to their sinking ship. They are grooming Lila to be just as hollow as they are. You must ensure Selena retains absolute fiduciary control. She is the only one who will not break under their manipulation. Elias stopped the recording. My father stared at the phone as if it were a live explosive device. Before my parents could even attempt to formulate a coherent lie to defend themselves against the voice of a dead woman, Brooke Whitaker moved. She walked purposefully to the table and dropped a glossy 40-page printed document right on top of Raina's financial dossier. Beside it, she placed a stapled legal packet. "Speaking of sinking ships," Brooke said, staring directly at my sister, "let us talk about your post-wedding business strategy." Lila recoiled, her face draining of all natural color. "This is a pitch deck for a luxury lifestyle brand," Brooke announced to the room, turning her stern gaze to her own parents, who were standing frozen near the entryway. Lila drafted this to secure venture capital immediately after the honeymoon. The entire business model is anchored on utilizing the Whitaker family reputation, our corporate client list, and our established commercial credit lines. But it gets much worse. Brooke tapped the stapled legal packet with her fingernail. This is a draft of a post-nuptial agreement circulating between Lila and her private attorney. The strategy was to trick Owen into signing it next month under the guise of consolidating household insurance policies. Buried in the fine print is a joint liability clause that would legally force my brother to absorb the massive, hidden debts her parents incurred to pay for yesterday's spectacle. Owen had remained completely silent since entering the room. He stood near the grand fireplace, his posture rigid, his eyes dark and unreadable. He slowly walked over to his new bride. Lila looked up at him, her lips trembling, fresh tears spilling over her perfectly contoured cheeks. "Owen, please," Lila whispered, reaching out to grasp his dark suit jacket. "They are lying. They are just trying to ruin us." Owen stepped back smoothly, completely refusing her touch. "I read the metadata on those files myself," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Was any of it real? Lila? Or was this entire narrative of legacy wealth just a meticulously crafted stage production? Did you just drag my family into a pit of debt decorated with imported white roses?" Grant and Melissa realized simultaneously that the Whitakers were not just disgusted, they were entirely done. The wealthy in-laws they had sacrificed everything to impress were currently looking at them like they were contagious diseases. Total panic set in. They abandoned all pretense of dignity or control. "Selena, listen to me," Grant pleaded, his voice cracking violently. He rounded the table and grabbed my arm. I did not flinch or pull away. I just stared at his hand until he slowly released his grip. "We can sort out all of this internal accounting later. We can fix the ledgers, but we are completely out of time. Just sign the release documents right now so the bank can clear the funds today. We will pay you back." "I swear it." "Please, darling," Melissa begged, genuine tears streaming down her face, entirely ruining her expensive makeup. "Just put your name on the paper. Do it for the family. We just need to get through today." In their absolute panic, they did not realize they had just confessed out loud in front of the bank representative. They openly admitted that the numbers were fraudulent and that they solely required my physical presence as a living rubber stamp to force the illegal transaction through the system. The closing agent for Harbor Crest Capital forcefully zipped his leather briefcase shut. The sharp sound ripped through the desperate begging. "Absolutely not," the agent declared, stepping firmly away from the mahogany table. With a contested signature, documented financial irregularities, and an open admission of ledger manipulation, this commercial loan is suspended indefinitely. I am legally obligated to report this entire exchange. Our internal compliance division will be launching a full investigative review by noon today. Do not contact our offices again. He turned and walked out the front door, taking the bridge loan, the shell company, and their entire financial future with him. The sound of the heavy oak door clicking shut behind the banker was the final trigger. The immense, crushing pressure of reality broke Lila completely. The sweet, elegant, soft-spoken facade violently detached from her personality. She lost complete control. "Why do you even care about the medical accounts?" Lila shrieked, her voice tearing through her throat, echoing horrifyingly off the vaulted ceilings. She pointed a shaking finger at the audio recorder resting on the table. "She is dead. Grandmother is in the ground. She does not need the money anymore. I am alive. My social standing is happening right now. We deserve that money to build my future, and you ruined it over a corpse." The entire room turned to ice. The string of horrific, selfish words hung in the air, vibrating with an ugly, naked truth. Even Grant and Melissa stared at their youngest daughter in absolute shock. For the very first time, the entire room heard exactly what resided underneath the expensive silk blouses and the curated social media posts. There was no misunderstanding. There was no administrative error. There was just pure, rotting entitlement. Owen stared at the woman he had married less than 24 hours ago. The look of profound betrayal in his eyes morphed into something much colder. It was the look of a man who had just narrowly escaped a burning building. He reached down to his left hand. He grasped the heavy gold wedding band resting on his ring finger. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the ring off. Lila stopped screaming. She gasped, her eyes widening in sheer terror as she realized exactly what he was doing. "Owen, no," she whispered, her voice suddenly small and fragile. "You promised me forever. I will not spend the rest of my life anchored to a foundation of lies framed by wedding photographs," Owen stated. He walked over to the mahogany table, picked up his sister's printed pitch deck, and set his gold wedding band squarely on top of it. "Have your lawyers contact mine by tomorrow morning." He turned his back on his bride, signaled to his parents, and walked out of the dining room. The heavy oak door shut behind him with a resonant, final thud. The marriage, barely a day old, had cracked and shattered beyond any hope of repair. The sound of the heavy oak door clicking shut behind Owen Whitaker hung in the dining room like the final toll of a funeral bell. The suffocating silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the remaining members of my family as the absolute reality of their destruction finally set in. They had spent 2 years meticulously building a towering, fragile monument to their own vanity, and it had just been completely demolished in less than 30 minutes. But the legal tribunal was not quite finished. Elias Bramwell stepped forward. He calmly unbuttoned his dark suit jacket and placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany table, right next to the sealed folders of financial evidence. He looked directly at my father. "There is one final administrative matter to clarify," Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "Pursuant to Section 4, Paragraph 9 of the June Stanton Legacy Trust, there is a strict penalty clause regarding the fraudulent encumbrance of estate assets. Given the documented evidence of financial manipulation, forged electronic signatures, and the deliberate misappropriation of the medical reimbursement funds, a mandatory legal trigger has just been activated." Grant raised his head, his eyes wide and completely uncomprehending. "What does that mean?" "It means," Elias continued, his tone entirely devoid of any professional sympathy, "that any and all residual claims, administrative input, or future beneficiary status you or your dependents held regarding Blackwood Cottage are hereby suspended indefinitely. Full, unmitigated guardianship of the property and all remaining liquid assets instantly reverts to the sole discretion of the active trustee, Helena Stanton, and the Independent Fiduciary Board, the independent title examiner, who had been quietly organizing her documents, placed a heavy red seal on the disputed closing packet. She slid it swiftly into her briefcase. The room, which had been so carefully staged with expensive beeswax candles and fresh white hydrangeas to celebrate a financial victory, had officially become the site of their legal and financial ruin. They had not just lost the commercial bridge loan needed to cover the massive wedding debts, they had permanently lost any ability to treat Blackwood Cottage as a private source of cash ever again. The sheer gravity of the situation finally broke through my mother's decades of carefully constructed denial. Melissa collapsed into the antique dining chair. She did not manufacture elegant, silent tears this time. She began to weep with ugly, profound desperation. "Selena, please," Melissa choked out, reaching her trembling hands across the table toward me. "They are going to call in the debts today. The shell company will collapse. They will take our primary home. You have to at least save the house. You cannot just leave us with absolutely nothing." Grant moved to stand beside his wife. His polished, commanding country club persona was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, slumping posture of a broken man. "We are your family, Selena. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot just stand there and watch us drown. We made terrible mistakes, but you have the power to fix this right now." Before I could even formulate a response, Lila turned on them. The golden child, the beloved daughter they had compromised their entire moral foundation to elevate, instantly bared her teeth at the very people who had funded her expensive illusions. "You did this to me," Lila screamed at our parents, her face twisted in a mask of pure, selfish rage. "You promised me everything was secure. You told me the trust was mine, and the money was guaranteed. I never asked you to forge a signature. You completely ruined my life." She shifted the blame entirely, acting as if she had never demanded a lifestyle vastly exceeding their financial capabilities, as if she had not happily worn the replica jewelry while the real heirlooms were sold to pay her credit card minimums. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the bitter, vicious echoes of their true dynamics bouncing off the stone walls. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl bitter insults or scream about the dark catering tent from the weekend. The time for anger had passed, leaving behind a profound, crystalline clarity. "The stranger is not me," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through their chaotic arguing with the force of a physical blow. They all stopped and looked at me. "The stranger," I continued, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes, "is the version of me you genuinely thought you could humiliate, isolate, and then force to stand up and sign my own life away. You spent 35 years demanding that I shrink myself to fit into a space that was convenient for your lies. I am not doing it anymore." I picked up my grandmother's worn leather notebook and slid it securely into my briefcase. "I will not authorize the release of the trust," I declared, my words sealing their fate with absolute finality. "I will not authorize any external loans, and I will not serve as a financial cushion for your chronic irresponsibility. Blackwood Cottage will never be sold to feed your delusions again." I turned my back on them and walked out of the grand dining room. I walked out the heavy oak front door, stepped into the crisp, freezing mountain air, and drove away. The fallout over the next few months was swift and entirely merciless. Without the bridge loan to cover the massive wedding debts and the fraudulent shell company exposed, my parents' financial house of cards collapsed completely. They were forced to liquidate their primary residence to avoid federal bankruptcy charges, quietly downsizing into a small, unremarkable rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. Lila's marriage did not even survive the mandatory legal waiting period. Owen filed for a formal annulment citing massive financial fraud before the end of the month. Stripped of the Whitaker name and the fabricated legacy wealth she had used to build her brand, her social circle vanished instantly. The wealthy, influential friends she had spent 2 years desperately courting disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, abandoning her the very moment the money stopped flowing. I did not watch their downfall with joy, but I did not offer a single dollar to stop it. I was finally free. Over the following year, I used my undisputed fiduciary authority to enact a complete, radical transformation of the estate. I worked closely with Elias and the independent board to legally repurpose Blackwood Cottage. We completely renovated the property, removing the dark, heavy memories of my parents' constant demands. We renamed it Juniper House. It was no longer a dormant asset waiting to be exploited. It became a fully funded private retreat for women who were actively recovering from severe financial manipulation, familial abuse, and toxic relationships that had systematically made them forget their own inherent worth. It became a sanctuary for people who had been treated as disposable tools by the very people who were supposed to love them. On a quiet, sunlit Saturday morning in late spring, I stood alone in the newly renovated long dining room of Juniper House. The dark mahogany was gone, replaced by a massive, bright oak table that stretched across the airy space. Sunlight poured through the open windows, bringing the fresh scent of pine and wild lavender into the room. I looked down the length of the table. Every single chair was equal. There were no hidden corners. There were no secondary tents pitched in the mud by the noisy generators. There was absolutely no one here who would ever be forced to beg for a seat at the table, and no one who would ever be pushed out into the cold just to preserve an ugly lie. For the very first time in my entire life, I understood what true healing actually meant. Healing was not about waiting patiently for your toxic family to finally choose you. Healing was not about proving your worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding you. Healing was about taking the broken pieces they left behind and building an entirely new space where absolutely no one had the power to demean you ever again. At my sister's wedding, I was treated like a stranger, so I walked out. And that walk saved me from spending the rest of my life as the person they expected to sign away my future for their convenience. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey of finding justice and healing, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button on the video, and show your support by clicking the hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people who might need to hear it.